Okay, good afternoon. We're joined now by Ed Sullivan, who's the Training Development Manager for EMEA. And Ed has kindly joined us to add to our discussions that we have been having and will have in our presentation skills training programme. So Ed, you're very welcome this afternoon.
Fine, thanks for the opportunity of joining it.
You're very welcome, thank you. Ed, we were going to talk about, we have a series of skills that we're actually going to examine on our presentation skills training. But what you were suggesting to me was maybe we could cluster them into smaller groups or smaller sort of clusters of skills. And you were talking, I think, about body language, you were talking about listening and questioning skills, and you were also talking about planning and preparation skills. And maybe if we talked about those skills at a higher level first, we could then subsequently drill down to some more specific skills later on.
Yeah, I think that'd be handy because that allows us really to look at it in two contexts. One is, if you like, the general overview, and then the other is obviously specifics that perhaps provide some of the scheduled contents of the programme that you're going to run with your colleagues. So what I'd also like to do in doing this is not only talk in generalities, but perhaps give one or two anecdotes based on personal experience, which I think might help in terms of some of those areas.
Okay. Well, we were looking at, I know in our training programs we actually look at body language, and within the body language package we look at things like postures and gestures, we look at smiling, we look at eye contact and a whole variety of other things.
You're doing it now.
Yeah, I know. So, would you have any specific comments on those issues, and how beneficial are they to good presentations?
Yeah, in fact, presentation skills, I guess, is one of a channel of communication. In the same way, there are other forms of channels like appraisals, perhaps like videos or whatever. But of course, one of the unique benefit about a presentation is you are there visibly in front of people, and that therefore your body language is something that leaks through as a communication device, which can be used to your advantage or disadvantage. So when I think about body language, we're obviously thinking of the key areas of body language skills there, and what the old mnemonic I always remember is SOLA, straight onto the audience, open gestures to engage people, leaning forward as a method of attentive engagement, lots of eye contact but not over eye contact, responses in terms of perhaps gestures of the head or give me some more information, and intermittent responses as we go along there. So SOLA is a way that I tend to remember that, and that demonstrates itself in all communication channels. Specifically on presentation skills, and a really good example of this is when we took take one of this programme a little earlier, that I remember interviewing a colleague some years ago in a similar situation, and 90% of the take was actually done in one run. The last fine-tuning took about 12 runs, and it was because the cameraman literally asked us to suddenly get a lot closer. And of course that intimacy therefore made it more uncomfortable for the pair of us, and we found we were stuttering and the difficulties there. So even the extent to which one is either near a group or away from a group, so can have some advantages and disadvantages as the case may be. Certainly in terms of presentation skills, things that kind of help would be personal confidence, and that comes in things like preparation and planning, and perhaps some tips and techniques there. But that confidence is likely to show itself in terms of being on stage in the presentation that you give. So that leakage actually confirms I'm someone that knows this area, I'm someone that can work within this area, and that helps you.
Just to interrupt, how could somebody develop that confidence? Say somebody starting from a position where they feel they don't have the confidence to do very competent presentations. What sort of things should they get involved in to maybe help enhance that self-confidence?
Well, I guess there's two or three things that immediately would come to mind. One is incrementally building up the skills, so to do it, to practice it, to get some feedback on it, perhaps looking at yourself on video such that you can actually see the effect of your body language in situations and how it enhances or detracts from presentations. So incremental building up is quite useful in that respect. Observed feedback, someone giving you direct feedback in that arena. The third is all the other kind of areas that you've got that can get in the way, like barriers, like technology. Make sure you've got the room sorted out, you know exactly what you want to do, so that all those distractions aren't there influencing the main media, which is to get across to the audience. So preparation, I remember when I first did presentation skills, someone's asked me what are the 3 P's of presentation skills, and it was prepare, prepare, and prepare. Now I don't necessarily agree with that, because I think actually spontaneity is quite important, and in that context you can over-prepare, that may be associated with your natural flair in these areas, but remember you can be none other than yourself. But the skills that we develop, some of the techniques we develop, will actually help you to be more of yourself. So practice, rehearsal, perhaps feedback from a colleague, perhaps CCTV or whatever as a medium to demonstrate the effect that you're having could all be areas which I think are worth exploiting.
Yeah, I've heard some people in sales now, they might use mirrors even when they're actually talking on the telephone. They work with mirrors, and it helps them smile, and also helps in the preparation as well, using mirrors as well.
Okay. Funny enough, at this weekend I was just away, and I was at a musical college and happened to note that there were mirrors in the practice rooms there, and it was so that the students got a good idea of their posture, which is a physical aspect, but also the extent to which they were relating with an apparent audience as well. So I think that could be quite a good technique.
Yeah. Okay. We kind of talked about body language and moving on to kind of listening and questioning type skills now as well.
Right.
I suppose that's quite a complex area because we delve into like active listening, which is a whole area in itself. Maybe facilitation skills. We're looking at, defining the boundaries of the presentation, which is probably a very useful one, particularly if you're going to introduce open questions into your sort of presentation format.
Right.
So I suppose there's a whole lot of issues around there that maybe we could discuss around listening and questioning.
Yeah, in terms of questioning technique, we always talk about the two primary type of questions. Open questions, which are normally preceded by big generalities like why, who, what, etc. And then more closed questions where you're looking for specific information, yes or no, or perhaps a fact. And in essence, what underlies those is something which we use, which we might call a funnel technique. You start with open, you get the response, demonstrate that you're listening to the response in that particular respect. You may further probe by use of further open questions, and I'll give an example shortly. And eventually you're going to close. Now, if you consider that to be a series of sandwiches, if you like, question, listening, questioning, listening, etc., we're also putting focus at the end in order to close. Closure brings control, whereas openness brings discussion. Now, it's fairly evident you want the discussion to start the process. You want to avoid it meandering into another area.
Yeah. What sort of techniques could you use to avoid discussions going off at a tangent such that you can't control it?
Well, a couple of ones, again, that come to mind is you certainly need to acknowledge the question. You may say that's a really quite interesting question. I need to kind of put it into a context, so let me rephrase that question in the context of what we're now dealing with.
Yeah.
Or alternatively, that's such an open question, perhaps I can hold that to later on while we focus in on the particular issue that we're dealing with now. You've got to be very careful that the person doesn't feel put down in that situation, but both parking, which was that second one, and alternatively rephrasing is quite useful. The other thing which I find very useful is that there will be times you are asked a question by the participants and you don't know what the answer is. A really good technique there is to rephrase the question by saying, but before we move on and perhaps I give my contribution to the debate, let's just get some clarification of what the question is, and let's get views from other people in the audience. So even in a situation where you could be losing control, you don't know the answer, typically someone in the group is likely to be able to help, and that also gives you time to build on it. So that's a reciprocal side of things, where you're actually receiving either a statement or a question which is going to provide difficulties to you, and where that rephrasing is useful. In terms of in terms of listening, we've talked about body language and the active listening posture, so on and so forth from there. The other three areas would be reflecting, where an actual word that is given to you is rephrased back. So you may say, someone may say, that doesn't certainly happen in my environment, and you say, your environment? And perhaps again there you saw the gestures. So basically I'm getting clarification through there, and actually also confirming that I've listened. Paraphrasing, which is a small version of what I've just heard. So maybe someone's talking about their experiences in sales, and this doesn't work, so on and so forth, in which case you would say, well, obviously there's different ways this applies. Okay, so you're acknowledging again. The other key thing, which is kind of to do with structure, is actually summarising. So when you want to move on from one subject to another, that's a good time perhaps to use a closing question. So is there anything more that we need to add? Okay, no, there doesn't seem to be anything, so let's just summarise where we are, because we now need to move on to another subject. So there's some techniques that perhaps precede what you were saying, i.e. I'm controlling the situation, but equally I'm also trying to deal with the rapport of the group at the same time by demonstrating active listening. Now, I don't know whether you feel that's a reasonable explanation to that particular question you put me.
I think it does, because it also helps as well, just using those active listening techniques to maybe to close out certain sections of the presentation. Because one of the things we were discussing was, say for example, somebody had to do a presentation that was an hour in length. That can be quite a very long presentation, so actually breaking it down to smaller modules, and then using those techniques to actually demonstrate to the group that we're now finished with module 1 and we are now going on to module 2, we're finished with module 2 and we're now going on to module 3, does demonstrate in some sense that there's structure, there's preparation, and that actually you are in control of the presentation as well.
And the other thing is learning is made in chunks.
Exactly.
So if you were eating a meal, you're not going to have a soup with your ice cream at the same time. You're actually going to have natural phases and parts to it. At the end of the day, it may well actually, in an hour's presentation, to deliberately have some time out. I don't know what concentration spans are on presentation, but an hour is going to be a fairly long time.
Yeah, well, there's loads of speculation. Like people now talk about the MTV generation. That after the average size of your pop video after 3 minutes, that's it. The attention span is gone.
Right.
I'm not sure if it's as bad as that in corporate land, but it is something to bear in mind. That, and they have another phrase as well. I hear learning is a multi-step process.
Right.
So in other words, you just don't learn in one big chunk, which you were saying earlier on. It has to be a layered process. And you have to build a foundation for learning and then get more specific as you move along.
Yeah, so there I think we've got, we would naturally talk about the context. Why are you learning this? What are we learning? And then review sections and summarising before we move on to the next stage. So that's a series of connections and structures. The other thing that comes to mind is the tell, show and do variable, where I could present and just tell people for an hour. And the recall is going to be 10% if I'm lucky. If we can actually use images or indeed get hands-on experience, it's likely that by using those other parts of the psychology in the mind, if you like, that we're actually going to communicate not just verbally but in the other areas, and that actually opens up additional channels. So if you can get people to do things, if you can get some of the audience themselves participating, that's also very useful. You've got to be a bit careful there. My experience is that sometimes people don't necessarily say the right thing at the right time, from my perspective anyway. And in that particular context, you need to perhaps have a flavour of the group and their capacity to respond in a particular structure or whatever. Now, I guess what do I mean by that? I mean, I can remember on one occasion getting involved with a group, and one person was definitely not participating, and I kind of saw it as my challenge to involve him through the programme, and when I did engage in it, it actually tended to embarrass him even further. The underlying issue was that person didn't want to be at the presentation. So again, another feature of preparation is try and find out the attitudes and disposition of the people that are likely to be in the meeting. They all want to get something out of it. That's definitely true, but some people might be more willing to get something out of it than others. Now, when you talked about a multi-step process, the issue is that knowledge is about information, skills is about application. It's quite often the attitudes that you're addressing, and until we get perhaps some optimism on the attitudes, you'll find that the next step of learning won't take place. So most people now need to think, I can get something out of this. I
suppose, actually, you brought up an interesting point there. You could ask the question, when does the presentation begin? Because I suppose if you make the assumption that the presentation begins at 9 and finishes at 10, there probably is some work you could have done before even people arrive in the presentation to make sure that the right motivations are there, the right attitudes are there. And that could be some work that could have been done beforehand. I don't know how. Again, there'll be different ways of actually doing that.
Yeah. Well, certainly the engagement process might describe itself in some ways. A lot of my presentation is in the context of learning as opposed to presentation skills there. And what I always tend to know is the first 10 minutes of any programme, no one's hearing anything. Really not. Everyone's a little bit concerned about being there. Do I have to get up on stage or whatever? And in that particular context, if you can actually fairly early in the learning activity get the group to do something themselves, that really does relax them. and that says it's okay to do things here.
Yeah, I suppose that's the icebreaker, really. That's
Yeah.
probably very important for every sort
A
of
really
presentation.
good example of it. So, for instance, if you were doing a day's training, you're going to have an icebreaker of at least 10-15 minutes just to get people settled into the room. The other great thing I kind of remember is that presentation skills are a bit like an aeroplane. You remember the takeoff and you remember the landing. The bits in the middle perhaps will lose some significance. So again, tell them what you're going to say, tell them, and remind them that what's been said. Kind of a bit of a cliche, but obviously I guess it fits into that structure. And the fact that you're getting attention at the beginning of the program and towards the end.
Yeah, it's quite interesting because we do do an exercise in the presentation skills training where we actually create a 9 o'clock news. We actually work with some news clippings and we actually construct a news program. We actually do use that particular technique you were talking about, where we're very specific about our headlines. Then we have our main story, and then we definitely go to the trouble of having a very thorough summary. Because we're reinforcing the point. And again, it's like we tell the same story from 3 different directions or 3 different perspectives. And we're not only reinforcing the story, but maybe in the 3rd perspective, that's the one that clarifies maybe the message for the actual listener.
Yeah, and we talk about different personalities having different learning styles. So I could say, for instance, some people have a habit of liking concepts. Some people have a habit of liking detail. So if you can get both types of information in your presentation, it's likely both parties are feeling fairly good about the output. If you just do, here's an hour on theory or here's an hour on products, I don't think that's going to do you a lot of good. So variety would also tend to spice up a presentation. The explanation you've given, which is a repetitive, different perspective, but in different varied media, I think sounds a very good mix.
Actually, you brought us on to our next subject, which we want to talk about, which is planning and preparation. And I suppose part of that process as well is structure, because that's what we were talking about there. Tell them what you're going to tell them what you told them. That essentially is how we structure the presentation. So that's all included in our planning process, included in our preparation process as well.
Yeah, I guess it's like a tip of an iceberg, really. One perhaps might do a presentation that's going to last 20 minutes. Typically, you might have actually at least spend a couple of hours actually preparing that. Think in terms of the audience is a kind of useful reference point. We have a great habit in our organisation and many organisations to think about our words. We therefore get jargon, UPSs, APCs, so on and so forth, which we make certain assumptions about in terms of understanding. You can find that actually goes completely over the top. Now, I'm not suggesting we'd be simplistic. We do have certain assumptions that we can make, that we all understand what APC is or whatever, but equally it is worth checking that out from every now and then. The other thing that you tend to find is in a group you're going to get different levels of expertise, and that therefore if you're engaging a particular group, it's quite important you've got a reference level in which you feel, well, this is the right level to pitch it.
When should you do that? Is that best done, if it's possible, it's probably best done before the actual presentation itself?
Without a doubt. So, an ideal thing would be to perhaps ask 2 or 3 people that are going to be on the presentation, well, what sort of things would you be interested in knowing? A good example, once you're going to develop the skills, is to say, well, look, I've got an hour's presentation. I've certainly got half an hour, which is already structured within that. But I do want to come back to you in terms of your particular requirements so that we can meet your needs. So therefore, before we start, the topic is, please tell me what you feel you want to cover in the next 40 minutes, either by presentation or by post-discussion. So if you can engage the population and ask them what they want to know in a very experiential, contemporary sense, that's useful as well. That probably requires a bit of confidence and a little bit of practice before you can do that. It could be seen as this guy hasn't done any preparation at all. So be spontaneous, but have that preparation behind you, because it'll help the needs of the audience. The last thing you want to do is, maybe I'm doing it now myself, is ramble on and not really come to a focus towards the end, where you actually perhaps want the order, perhaps you want the commitment, perhaps you want the buy-in. So it's really important to think about the outputs as well.
That's brilliant, Ed. Well, thanks very much.
Yep.
So, in this section of this DVD, Ed, we were looking at body language, and we had a fairly thorough discussion about issues around body language. We looked at eye contact, postures and gestures. We also looked at listening and questioning skills, talked about active listening, maybe starting off with open questions and focusing down to a particular closed sort of section. And we also looked at the importance of planning with preparation, and planning in terms of structure, and also preparation in terms of your own delivery of the presentation as well.
Yeah. One aspect I guess I didn't perhaps mention on structure is the connections.
Yeah.
So they're moving from one to another. We talked about closure in terms of summarising or whatever. Make sure that if you can get a link word that actually transposes between one section and another, that would be fairly useful as well. So certainly think about those connection points that move you from A to B. I suppose the other thing is how engaging you want the discussion to be. You can have a one-way presentation, or you can have a two-way discussion. I guess you could have a free-for-all.
Yeah, well, I suppose it depends on the context, and it depends on what the nature of the presentation is, what the nature of the information that's been transmitted is.
Yeah.
So there's a variety of influences there, factors that need to be considered.
Again, the when it's training as well as presentation, the adage I'd use is the more you can get the people themselves doing, the better, because people have got a vested interest and a nice interest in sharing their knowledge as a group, rather than always being led by a presenter.
That's it, yeah. Okay, well listen, thanks very much, Ed, for joining us today. Okay. So later on in this DVD, we will delve into more detail some of the specific issues that we talked about. But for this section, thank you very much to Ed Sullivan.
Great,
thank
I
you.
Enjoyed that. Thanks a lot.
Cheers. So you can actually see the idea. I can actually see what's actually recorded.
Yeah, that's right.
Was that it? Oh yeah. Okay. Right. Right. So you have the script there. So.
Okay.
Right.
It's rolling. Yeah.
It's rolling. Yeah. Okay. Good afternoon. We're actually joined today by Ed Sullivan, who's the Training Development Manager for EMEA. And Ed has kindly joined us today to maybe give us a little bit more insight into some of the presentation skills that we were talking about at our recent trainings. And this will also help us when we subsequently do further presentation skills trainings. Okay, start again. Right, take two. Okay.
The better, because people have got a vested interest and a nice interest in sharing their knowledge as a group, rather than always being led by a presenter.
Okay, well listen, thanks very much, Ed, for joining us today. So later on in this DVD, we will delve into more detail some of the specific issues that we talked about. But for this section, thank you very much to Ed Sullivan.
Great,
thank
I
you.
Enjoyed that. Thanks a lot.
Cheers. How was it for you?
We kind of went all over the place. Well, it was natural enough, wasn't it?
It was like, yeah. Actually, I was looking at myself in the. I could see myself being. I was afraid of moving because that's about.